This podcast is brought to you in part by Bradley, a full-service law firm representing clients across the country from 9 offices, including Jackson, Mississippi. Learn more at bradley.com.
Pour yourself a sweet tea, pull up a lawn chair, and turn the page with us. You're listening to Right On Mississippi, a podcast taking you inside the minds of America's most treasured wordsmiths. Hosted by Ebony Lumumba and brought to you by the Mississippi Book Festival, the South's literary lawn party. Chapter 3, Salman Rushdie. This is Ebony Lumumba. We're with Right On Mississippi, and we're talking about writing that isn't necessarily distinct to our state, but one of the authors I've been reading for a decade and a half at least, and I'm so thrilled to have across from me Salman Rushdie. Hello.
Hello. That was so nice to be here.
It is nice to have you, and we felt your wind coming in when you got into Mississippi, right? So you've changed the atmosphere.
Oh, well, okay, yes, I carry these special effects around with me.
Right, pyrotechnics and all of it, yeah. So this interview, we want it to be more of a conversation. You've done probably more interviews over your career than you can count, but I want to ask you some of the things that perhaps you never really get to disclose,
okay.
Right? So nothing about your writing process or what inspires you, but I'm kind of interested in what you read and what you're reading right now. What's on your bedside table?
Right now, what am I reading? I mean, the thing is, when I'm right in the middle of writing a novel right now, and when I'm doing that, I tend not to read a lot of other fiction because, you know, the especially great writers, very good writers, often have infectious voices. You know?
So they find they're creep into your
So you find yourself
process.
trying to write like Hemingway or something, you know, and that's usually a mistake.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think you can do it without the drinks.
And what I know exactly, well, he couldn't do it. But I also find that the book that I'm writing itself demands that I read certain things, you know, so I can learn about things, find out about things. So I tend to read around what I'm writing. But one of the books that accidentally helped to kickstart this book was, of all things, Don Quixote. You know, that
You're kidding.
Yeah, that last year, I don't know if you remember, last year was this big anniversary. It was the 400th anniversary both of Cervantes and of Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. I remember.
You know, had the same birthday.
Yeah.
Amazingly.
Wait, now that I don't think I even cataloged. That is amazing.
Amazing, but true. Same date of the same year.
Wow.
And so there were a lot of literary events that I found myself at where people wanted to discuss both of those, both Cervantes and Shakespeare, and so I hadn't read Don Quixote since I was at college, you know.
No.
So, and as it happens, there is a wonderful new translation by Edith Grossman, which is the best translation there's ever been.
What
in English.
makes it the best?
It's just the most colloquially written. It feels like a contemporary novel, you know, and not like some dusty old classic. It feels like somebody just wrote it, you know. And so I had read that again, and it got me thinking, you know. And so I'm writing this thing, which is in part it's a road novel, in part it's a novel about an old man being obsessed with a woman he doesn't even know, you know, which is what happens in Don Quixote. You know?
Yeah, exactly. I know it very well.
And so it's growing into a kind of a way of looking at what's happening in the country now, but through this very comic.
We're not talking about any old man in particular obsessed with women.
Well, no. I mean, one of
No.
the things that I discovered early on in my writing, that people these days are obsessed with the idea of autobiography. You know,
That's very true.
And people always think they ask you which character in the novel is you. You know, and you think, well, really, none of them and all of them. You know,
Right,
I mean, Flaubert famously, when he was asked this question, said, "Madame Bovary, that's me." You know, c'est moi. You know,
Exactly.
and so I began to be kind of perverse about this and be determined not to have a character in a book that people could say, "Oh, that's him."
Well, it makes authors seem very egotistical. That I've got to write myself into.
Well, there's a reason for sometimes. I mean, there are some wonderful books where writers deliberately have characters who are close to them. You know, that if you read Philip Roth, then knowing, you know, Nathan Zuckerman is a kind of version of Philip Roth. And if you read Saul Bellow, then Moses Herzog is kind of a version of Saul Bellow. If you read Proust, then Marcel in À la Recherche is I mean, he even has the same first name as Proust.
Mm-hmm.
But then you discover that they're not the same. You know, that Stephen Dedalus is not James Joyce. You know, that Marcel is not Proust. And when I wrote, ages ago, when I wrote Midnight's Children, the narrator of that novel has a lot in common with me. And, you know, he's the same age as me. He essentially grows up in my neighborhood, and he goes to my school, and a lot of his boyhood friends are kind of composite versions of but he himself, I don't think, is at all like me. You know, so I put him into a world that I knew, you know, a world that was incredibly familiar to me because it was the world I grew up in. But I don't think he's like me, you know, and yet...
You don't think he's like you.
I don't do it. But
people who read the books,
people who read the books all think he's like me.
Of course.
But they're wrong.
Maybe some of that you'll just take.
Yeah, you just have... But I mean, for example, as a character, he's quite passive. Mm-hmm. You know, he's somebody. He's somebody to whom things happen. Mm-hmm. You know, he's not like a can-do guy. You know, he doesn't take charge.
That is true.
He's a target for what happens to him. You know, and I kind of, in a way, that sort of, when I was writing the book, I would sometimes get irritated with that, and I would want him to be more proactive. Mm-hmm. You know, and more heroic, if you like. You
sure.
know, and when I tried to write that, it was always awful.
Really? It wasn't organic.
It wasn't him.
You were forcing it
wasn't
onto him.
I was trying to make him do something that wasn't natural to him.
So he was his own being.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the things that happens all the time in writing is you make up these people, and they can be anything. You can make up anybody you like, but once you've made them up, then you can't change them.
You have to let them live.
Then they have to be that person. You know, and that's why I'm saying that I think, for a start with Salim, there's a thing. You know, when I was 14 years old. Just under 14 years old, I left Bombay, my hometown, and I went to first boarding school and then college in England, and then my life became, you know, in other countries. But it never happens to him. I mean, he never leaves home, you know. So his whole life is shaped by that period in India and Pakistan, you know. So his experience is completely unlike mine.
Did that feel like being home? Writing that character who was in a space that was so familiar to you? It
did, because one of the reasons for writing that book was that at that time I was living in London, and I was when I started writing that book I was like 28 or something, and I really was afraid that I was in danger of losing touch with where I came from, you know, and I in many ways wrote that book as a kind of act of reclamation, you know, to say, this is mine. You know, and I'm very happy I did, because it actually showed me the way.
We're in Mississippi, and I think a lot of Mississippi writers do something similar. Even if they leave the state or the South, they find themselves writing about the surroundings that are so near and dear to them. So it's endearing to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that Faulkner, for example, is a writer that a lot of people in India respond to very strongly, you know, and I think it's because of that sense of roots, that sense of, you know, writing about the world you came from and belong to, so on, you know, and so I mean, I had read Faulkner before I ever had set foot in the South, and
did that color your opinion about where you were headed?
Yeah, I mean, it made me read a lot of other writers of the South. You know, I found myself reading all these brilliant women writers. You know, Eudora Welty, Castle McCullers, Catherine Ann Porter, and you know, all these people, Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah.
And it was, in a funny way, even though it was a completely alien world to me, you know, there was a lot about it that was familiar. You know, in terms of the way families work, the way that people live in extended families. You know, and the contrast between poverty and wealth, and the very important place of religion, and you know, all these things. I thought, well, I know about this. You know, I know about it in a completely different way, but it's kind of the same. So I always felt very drawn to the literature of the American South.
What you're kind of speaking to is this formation of the global South, where there are these shared experiences or familiar cultural sort of practices of people all over the world in this region that we've kind of formulated. And literature is one of the spaces where that becomes very real.
Yes, I mean, the same thing happened to me when I started reading Latin American literature.
Me too.
And I thought, oh, I've never been there, but I know this. I know this, and then when I actually did begin to travel both in the American South and in Latin America, I thought, these books were telling the truth. It actually is a culture that I kind of recognize, for good or evil, but I get the point of it.
Yeah. We've got an episode with Robert St. John and Wyatt Waters, and they delve into sort of culinary landscapes, and we talked with them about how South Italy is very much like the American South in terms of the foodscape. And so that gets me to thinking about writing process and cultural practice that maybe takes you to the place where you feel most creative, most comfortable. You talk about writing Midnight's Children in a shell of what's familiar to you. Are there practices that you have, like things that you eat, drink, do, spaces that you like to be in when you're producing this work?
No, I mean, what I do have is I used to be very, very determined that I could only write in my special room to write in, and at a certain point you have to give that up.
Why is that?
Well, because life intervenes, and
you can't get to the room,
and you have to be all over
You've
the place.
You've got to travel,
and there are children, and there's there's a lot of stuff going on, and I had to teach myself that I would be able to write in anywhere that I was. And one of the tricks, there's an American writer who I think is a little bit forgotten in America now. He lived in England a long time, called Russell Hoban. Wrote very good children's books and some very good adult novels. He had a wonderful kind of post-nuclear war novel called Ridley Walker, which I strongly recommend. Anyway, Russell had this trick where he would carry around with him wherever he went, like 8 or 9 objects, like small personal objects,
Interesting.
And if he was like in a hotel room, wherever he was, he would arrange these objects, and it would take him like an hour. He wouldn't just put them out. He would arrange them in a kind of almost ritual relationship with each other.
Interesting. So he brought his
his world
with him.
Yeah, and once the objects were in the right place, then he was home, and he could work.
That's remarkable.
And I kind of learnt that trick, so I have a few objects.
What are your objects? You knew that was going to be the next question.
Well, I tell you, one of them is that probably the oldest possession that I have is that when I was a baby, my father's best friend gave to me, as it were, a little silver brick that's like an inch high, engraved with the map of India. And one of the things that is now powerful about that is that the map, as it's drawn on the brick, is the unpartitioned map.
I was about to ask, which map is it?
It's before. So India, Pakistan, there's no division. It's
before Midnight's Children.
Before the big division of 1947.
Right, 47.
So there's the unpartitioned map of India in this little brick, silver brick.
Beautiful.
And I carry that around. That's the most powerful thing.
It sounds powerful just in its own right, being this unpartitioned India of pre-47. But to you, what's the most meaningful element? Is it the familial connection,
it's
the
memory?
It's
the connection with my family and with my father, and all of that. And it's just become like a talisman.
Talisman, exactly.
Yeah, I can just touch it and feel good.
I need something like that. Typically, it's just a pillow. Can touch it and feel good with a nap.
Yeah, well, there's that too.
They're so infrequent, so infrequent. So you're in Mississippi now, and we take a great deal of pride in the writers from this space and what they produce and how they represent our realities. And you've talked a little bit about reading Faulkner and Welty and some other Mississippi writers and kind of formulating your idea of the state. But being in the space, does that challenge any of those ideas?
Well, it reinforces them, really, because I think one of the things which I'll actually talk about in my lecture is that there's a kind of writers like me whose lives have been uprooted, and which have ended up being in several different countries. There's a kind of envy of the deeply rooted writer. And I was just listening to Jesmyn Ward, and she was talking about, how she came back to the South in order to find her way as an artist, and how she feels that the fact that her characters are so grounded and have these foundations here is a thing which gives them hope. and gives them a way of seeing a hopeful future for themselves. And then I think, well, yeah, but that's really not been my experience. So there's a bit of me that envies, Faulkner taking this tiny patch of the world,
and creating an entire universe.
And finding it to be inexhaustible, enough for a lifetime of writing. And I think, okay, well, I admire that, but I can't do that. That's somebody else's work. And so then you think, you end up trying to find out what are your books to write, and you lose something, another door opens, and I think one of the things that's happened that I feel has become like a subject for me is that, we live in this very shrinking world. And now, in a way, we don't live lives which are sealed off from the rest of the world,
sure.
Because the rest of the world rushes in all the time. And so that question of connection, of how, even if you're living, in a small place in the deep south, you're not separate from history. That's to
Very
say,
true.
the way in which the world it works now is everywhere, affects everywhere else. And if you've had, I've had a lot of my life in India and Pakistan. I've had a lot of my life in England, and now the last 20 years I've been living in New York City. And I mean, I'm even an American citizen now, so I'm officially an American novelist. So,
this is true.
But what that does is it gives me, I think, an ability to take on the subject of that kind of connection. But how does over here connect to over there? How do the lives of people here connect to lives of people halfway across the world, and one of the things I really admire that's happening now in American literature and generations younger than mine is that there are so many writers now from all over the world, living and working as American writers, whether it's Chimamanda Adichie or Jhumpa Lahiri,
Two of my favorite.
Or Junot Diaz, or there's so many. There's Nam Le from Vietnam, there's Yi Yun Lee from China, and all these stories from all over the world are now becoming a part of the story of American literature.
It's a new Americanness. I
think it's so interesting, and then I think, well, I can do that, I mean, I've got suitcases full of stories from somewhere else, so it's in fact very interesting to get to I'm 71 now, but to get to that age and to find that the writers who are actually showing you the way are so much younger than you.
They're showing you the way.
Yeah.
I mean, that's remarkably humble. And I like that you're talking about this sort of new American identity. It's being forged by folks who we probably considered expatriates before, but now they're
American writers,
and
what they're doing is adding such richness to American literature by bringing in all these stories from everywhere.
Politics can learn something from writers.
Yeah, well, that's it, but they never do.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you've been writing for so long, and you're kind of talking about how it's evolved in terms of space and influence. What is the project that you have not written that you hope to produce?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Another good book.
Just a good book.
Really at this point, one of the things that happens when you get to my age is you become clear that there are fewer books in the future than there are in the past. That's to say, I now, what is it? I've published 18 books, 14 works of fiction and some of nonfiction. But it's quite clear that there's not another 18.
So, who's to say?
So what it means is that it focuses your mind. You think, okay, don't waste time. That if the time ahead is not infinite anyway. When you're a kid, you think life is infinite, and there's time to do everything.
You do.
And now you realize that ain't the case.
Not at all.
And so it makes you feel that whatever you do, it has to be absolutely the most central thing that you want to do at that time, and just forget about everything else. So what makes me do is to cut out a lot of peripheral activity. I just want to do the day job. And
really?
And however many books that means, I always, every writer fears running out of steam. Think, okay, this book's going to be the last. I often think with each book, I think this book's the last book. There isn't going to be anything after this. But so far, there's always something else.
There's a sort of haunting feeling that your usefulness is waning. I mean, I certainly don't feel that way, but
it's all of that. There's all that nervousness, but somebody once said that you should write every book as if it's your last book, and I think that's actually not a bad principle.
What's the benefit of that?
that you say everything you have to say.
Get it all out.
You have to say, you don't think, okay, I'll
save something for later.
Yeah, say everything you have to say.
Interesting. You mentioned Chimamanda Adichie, Jhumpa Lahiri, two of my absolute favorite writers. Who are you reading now?
Well, I mean, I read, both of those writers I admire very much. And I mean, they're friends also. And so
tell them I said hello.
I will. But I mean, I tell them, one of the things you do is you read your friends, So, and as it happens, I have a lot of writers who are friends. So I read DeLillo. I think he's maybe for me the greatest living American writer. Well, along with Tony.
Yeah. Who's still writing.
And I hear
she's much older than 71.
I hear she's writing a novel right now.
Yes, I've heard that as well.
Paul Auster, I read, and some of the younger writers I think Gary Steingart is incredibly funny, and and also very moving.
Yeah.
I like his stuff, and Nathan Englander. And in England, I mean, when I was living there, particularly in the 80s, it was a very rich generation for writing. There were writers like Angela Carter and Jeanette Winterson and Ian McEwan and Kazuo Ishiguro and Martin Amis and etc. And so we all grew up together and read each other's work. And then of course what happens is that you lose friends. I mean, some of the writers I was closest to aren't around anymore, like Raymond Carver, for example, or Bruce Chatwin, Angela Carter, they're people I was very close to. So there's sort of holes in the world. But fortunately, as I say, the thing about literature is it's an inexhaustible thing. There's so many people coming up all the time. So many. I mean, I hadn't read Jesmyn Ward till last year, and I really thought, wow,
So saying that, you read Ward last year, you're in Mississippi right now. This is Right on Mississippi. That's the name of this segment. And what I typically ask authors is what Mississippi means to them. But understanding your background and having lived all over the world, is there any chance that a little bit of Mississippi might creep into?
Well, I'll tell you what did. I mean, one of the great influences on me, and I think on many writers, is Huckleberry Finn, and I remember, this will amuse you, that when I first read Huck Finn, I must have been 20 years old or something, and I said, look, there's a thing that confuses me about this book, which is that here you have Jim running, trying to escape slavery.
Right.
Why is he on a raft on the Mississippi when it flows south?
I don't think we ever thought about this directionally.
How do you escape slavery?
That's an excellent practical question.
How do you escape slavery on a river that's flowing into the
slave state? Going against the grain,
exactly. And it always puzzled me. I thought there's something confusing about this.
I will never think of Huck Finn the same way.
So, there was a book written by a British writer called Jonathan, a long time in the 80s, which is in a way a response to Twain's life on the Mississippi. A book called Old Glory. This writer he's called Jonathan Raban. He's sort of a travel writer. But he wrote a book about going down the Mississippi in a small boat. And it's actually beautifully done. And he meets all kinds of people and so on. But just his description of the sailing, about how treacherous the river is, how there are areas where there are whirlpools, and also the riverbed varies dramatically in depth, So if you don't know the channel, you can find yourself stranded, on a sandbank or whatever,
it's
or
a
sunk.
Dangerous body of water.
And that, I thought, I like that book because of its portrait of the river, not just the life of
with a personality.
Yeah, exactly.
The river is a character.
You begin to think about the river as a And I've been to various points on the Mississippi. I've been to New Orleans quite a lot of times, and St. Louis, and various places. So, I think the Mississippi and I have a bit of a relationship.
Well, we're happy to hear that. That means that the stickiness of Mississippi has gotten you connected with us.
Yeah, I think so.
You'll always have a little bit of us and maybe come back to visit very soon.
I'd love to.
Well, this has been Right on Mississippi. And although Salmon says that he's 71 and you never know when the last book is going to be, we certainly hope that you write on.
Thank you.
Right on Mississippi. We want to thank Salman Rushdie for joining us today. Be sure to visit your local bookstore to purchase his work and keep up with him online by checking out the links in the description. Right on Mississippi is brought to you by the Mississippi Book Festival and Bradley Arendt and produced by Podastery Studios. Our guest for this episode was Salman Rushdie. Our editor was Joshua Heath, producer Holly Lang, executive producer Bo York, and I've been your host, Ebony Lumumba. We look forward to turning the page with you on the next chapter of Right On Mississippi.